be here tonight to introduce our guest speaker at our RightsTalk, Tarik Abdulhak. And I've just been told by Tarik that his name actually means servant of justice. So I think he was actually destined for this work. But before I begin tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we meet, and it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Tarik is one of those people who many Australians don't know much about, but I believe should. Although a cliche, he is what you might call a quiet achiever. He's done incredible and courageous work for the betterment of humanity. Quietly, without fanfare, acclaim or celebrity, and in often difficult and deeply distressing circumstances. As lead prosecutor in the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, or the ECCC, he has brought a voice to the voiceless and shone a light on what is one of the darkest periods in recent history. Under Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime, at least 1.75 million and as many as 2.2 million Cambodian people are believed to have died from starvation, torture, execution and forced labour between 1975 and 1979. This was out of a population of less than 8 million. But Tarik's tenacious and courageous quest for justice has brought hope to so many Cambodians who suffered and continue to suffer such terrible grief, loss and trauma as a result of this horrific period. Tarik has prosecuted the case against Kanguk Uv, alias Duch, the former chief of the Khmer Rouge's infamous prison S21. Duch was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of more than 12,000 victims. In the recently concluded trial of the senior leaders, Tarik was responsible for the prosecution of Khieu Samphan, chairman of Cambodia's state presidium during the Khmer Rouge regime. Prior to joining the ECCC, Tarik was no stranger to war crimes prosecutions. He was a senior legal advisor to the president of the Bosnian War Crimes Chamber, where he supervised numerous staff working on cases of international crimes. He's also worked as a litigation lawyer in a major commercial law firm, as a coordinator at a legal service in Sydney, and as an advocate for refugees and asylum seekers. He has authored academic papers and lectured internationally on issues of international criminal law and procedure. Tonight, Tarik will talk about the mass crime trials before the ECCC and the court's institutional and procedural framework. And it's indeed a pleasure and a privilege to introduce him to speak to us about his experiences with the ECC. He's available to take questions at the end of the presentation. So over to you, Tarik.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks everyone for inviting me to talk to you today about the Khmer Rouge trials. I'll just qualify the extremely generous introduction. I'm merely one of a number of advocates at the ECCC. I work with a team of very talented lawyers from various places around the world, and half of our team are Cambodians, which is one of the important features of the tribunal that I'll be talking to you about later tonight. I want to acknowledge a few people in the room who are also former ECC staff member and interns. You know who you are. I expect difficult questions from you at the end of the presentation. So why don't we start? Just a couple of warnings and a disclaimer. Some of the material I'm going to be dealing with is graphic. We're going to be seeing photographs of people subjected to torture. If you're not comfortable with seeing that type of material, can I suggest you don't stay and perhaps just watch my lecture on YouTube and perhaps skip through those parts. Some of the material is unpleasant, to put it mildly. Secondly, I'm a prosecutor. The case that we just prosecuted against senior leaders is pending judgment. And that means that whilst many of you guys who are familiar with the history of Cambodia might take some of these facts that I'll be talking about as matters of general knowledge, some of them are allegations yet to be established by the trial chamber. And so it would be inappropriate for me as a prosecutor to represent these as established facts beyond all reasonable doubt, when in fact the court is deliberating. So with that proviso, I'll get started. Some key terms. You're all familiar with the term Khmer Rouge, means the Red Khmers in French. It's a colloquial term coined by the late Norodom Sihanouk, the then Prince of Cambodia. It's a reference to people who were members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. That's the formal name of Cambodia's Communist Party at all relevant times for our purposes. Democratic Kampuchea, or DK, was the state that they established when they took power in 1975. It took a few months for that state to come into being. And so it was the new constitution was promulgated and a new state born, I think on the 5th of January 1976, if I recall correctly. Angkar or Angkar Lu, those words mean the organization or the upper organization. We in the prosecution allege that that term was a reference to the collective leadership of the Khmer Rouge. When orders were passed down the Khmer Rouge hierarchy to cadre at various levels, and ultimately down to people who were enslaved in forced labor camps and cooperatives, they were always communicated in the name of Angkar. And so most people only ever heard of Angkar and were not, did not know who in fact was in charge of the place. Some of these faces you will be familiar with. Pol Pot. His original name was Salazar. He was the secretary of the Communist Party of Kampuchea for more than 25 years. He was also Prime Minister of Democratic Kampuchea. He died in 1998 and was not ever tried for the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. Khieu Samphan, this is the man that Alex referred to earlier. He was the head of state during the Khmer Rouge period in power. He was a member of the Central Committee of the Khmer Rouge and had a long association with the other senior leaders of that movement. He had a PhD in economics from Sorbonne before he returned to Cambodia and took up his positions with the Khmer Rouge, so a highly educated, sophisticated politician. Nuon Chia, also known as Brother Number Two, he was Pol Pot's deputy, and at one stage, in fact, in the early years of the party, he was more senior to Pol Pot. He held the position of deputy party secretary essentially for the entire life of the Communist Party's existence. And he was in charge, among other things, for party discipline, education, and security. Yingsuri Elias Van was another member of the Standing Central Committee, again another member of the collective leadership. Now I should have said earlier, apart from Khieu Samphan, so Khieu Samphan, Nuon Chia, and Yingsuri were all charged in the same case, the case we call Case 002. Yingsuri died during trial, about a year and 3 months into the proceedings, and that was in March 2013, and proceedings were automatically terminated in relation to him. This is a photograph of the three men back during the DK period, arriving at Borikila, a party political school in Phnom Penh. Yingtirit Elias Pia was Yingsuri's wife and Minister for Social Affairs. She was the fourth accused in that case. She was found unfit to stand trial and was essentially released subject to measures of judicial supervision. She lives in Phnom Penh from time to time. And this is her during a visit to Laos with Khieu Samphan and her husband, Yingsuri. Now, Khmer Rouge history is a very complex subject matter, so I'm going to try and do this very quickly, and I'm going to try and be ambitious about it. The history of the Khmer Rouge, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, can be traced back to the establishment of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930. And that was a party that was established to fight primarily French colonialism in Indochina. What brought some of these young Cambodians together, some of the men and women that led the Communist Party of Kampuchea in the 70s, was the fact that they all studied in a couple of colleges in Phnom Penh and then received scholarships to undertake tertiary education in France. And so that's where some of their first political activity took place. In 1949, Pol Pot arrived in Paris. He was followed by Yin Seri, Khieu Samphan a couple of these years later, and a number of other men and women who would rise to be leaders of the Khmer Rouge. They formed a small secret study group called the Marxist Circle, which initially was a nationalist group that sought to fight colonialism in Indochina and to promote patriotism or Cambodian nationalism. In 1953, they decided to join forces with a group that was then called the Khmer Viet Minh. The Khmer Viet Minh were Cambodian communists who were operating under the tutelage of the Vietnamese Indo-Chinese Communist Party. By 1960, the young Cambodians decided to go it alone and to set up an independent Cambodian communist movement. And this was a key turning point in the life of that movement and also in the ideology, if you like, that they adopted. It was at that meeting that they identified a number of classes in society whom they saw as their eternal enemies, or classes with which they had what they called a life and death contradiction, which meant that for the one group to live, the other had to die. And they adopted a policy of using revolutionary violence. And we say that that's what led eventually to many of the atrocities that occurred in the 1970s. By 63, they were forced, a number of them, to flee Phnom Penh and to set up bases in the Cambodian jungles. And by 1968, they launched an uprising against the then government of Norodom Sihanouk. And then a key turning point, 1970. In 1970, Sihanouk, who was then ruling in a sort of head of state / head of government capacity, was toppled by one of his own ministers, Lon Nol, and removed from power. He was obviously desperate to get back into power and decided that the enemy of his enemy was a friend. And so he formed a coalition with the Khmer Rouge and called on the people of Cambodia to join the Khmer Rouge in order to assist him in restoring the monarchy. To be fair to him, at that point, the Khmer Rouge were not known for their brutality or atrocities, but there had been one of his enemies or opposition groups. A very bloody civil war followed from 1970 to 1975. On the one hand, you had the Sihanouk and Khmer Rouge coalition, and on the other, this coalition was supported by the Chinese government and the North Vietnamese forces. On the other side of that conflict was the Khmer Republic regime led by Lon Nol, the former Prime Minister. And this is the period that saw the radicalization of the Khmer Rouge ideologies. It was during that time that we see evidence of forced collectivization, forced evacuations of urban centers, enslavement of families within CPK-run cooperatives. And these measures are being taken with complete disregard for human suffering. Also, what occurs in this period, particularly from 72 onwards, is killings of dissidents, suspected spies, and prisoners of war. From about 1973 onwards, the Khmer Rouge didn't bother to interrogate or exchange prisoners of war, they simply executed them. And the same applied to foreigners, journalists, etc. Also from 72 onward, they set up a number of security centers, which really was what I would call the beginning of the slide into an abyss. These security centers emerged in a number of different areas of the country, and their function was to imprison, interrogate with the use of torture, and ultimately execute those considered to be enemies of the movement. The man whose picture you see on the screen was is Kangip Youth alias Dutch, a man Alex referred to earlier. He was, from 1971 onwards, chief of a security centre which operated in what the Khmer Rouge called the liberated zone. It's one of the parts of the country they controlled. He was a maths teacher, so another academically inclined individual who came under the influence of Son Sen, one of the Khmer Rouge leaders. He was ruthless and extremely efficient at his work. During the Khmer Rouge period from 1975 to 1979, he was in charge of the infamous S21, or sometimes referred to as Tallest Lane Security Centre. Those of you who have been to Cambodia or to Phnom Penh might have seen that place. It is still a museum to Khmer Rouge crimes. He was the man that Alex referred to, who was prosecuted at the ECC and found guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and sentenced to life imprisonment. And that's him there during the trial. He also testified in the trial of the senior leaders and described how at M13, so long before the rise of the Khmer Rouge to power, he was instructed to apply torture techniques on the prisoners. And some of the torture techniques that he mentions in this extract from the trial transcript is beating the prisoners, using electric shocks, waterboarding, simulated suffocation, etc. Now, one of the ways in which we know that this was a policy that was adopted and pursued by the leadership is by looking at party circulars, internal party communications from that time. We have, from that period, a number of these revolutionary flag magazines. It was a monthly circular which was sent to all party members, and it was an instruction in party ideology. I'm not sure if you can all see the second passage, but it's extremely important because, as I say, it's July 1973, so almost 2 years before they take power. And the instruction there is as follows, I'll read it. Quote, if the spies are arrested to be executed in a meeting before the people, some people may be frightened of us. They think that we're extremely cruel. The stance to smash the spies is correct, but it is inappropriately carried out. In other words, it's appropriate to smash, execute spies or suspected spies, but it shouldn't be done in public because it frightens people. They took power on the 17th of April 1975, so at the end of that 5-year civil war. And on that very day, the 17th of April, they proceeded to evacuate the entire city of Phnom Penh, and as the other cities and urban centres fell to their control, they too were forcibly evacuated. At the point of a gun, no exceptions allowed. Hospitals, the elderly, the infirm, etc., everybody had to leave their homes immediately. The evacuations were also accompanied by searches for identification of the members of the regime that had been toppled, and those found, we allege, were executed in thousands and thousands of cases. What I've tried to do on this screen is summarise the alleged atrocities that the Khmer Rouge stand accused of. Forced evacuations of all urban centres, effective enslavement of the entire civilian population in CPK cooperatives and work sites. They divided the population into two groups: new people, the evacuees, who were subjected to a harsher regime, and old people who were seen as being perhaps more loyal to the regime because they had already come to be under their administration in the years of the Civil War. They abolished schools and universities, laws and courts of law, property, money, markets, television and radio, all concepts of media or free expressions of one's opinion, freedoms of movement, association, etc., etc. The life that predated the arrival of the Khmer Rouge regime was replaced with one of enslavement in the camps, as I described earlier, and in a system in which all civilians, we allege, were subjected to systematic re-education and psychological and physical abuse. Everybody was forced to write biographies, which were used again to weed out those who may be opposed to the regime simply by virtue of their class background, or because of views that they held about communism or about the plans of the Khmer Rouge or about the instructions they were being given, about food they were being provided, etc. A system of forced marriage was put into place, which we allege resulted in rape on a mass scale in thousands upon thousands of cases. And the Khmer Rouge embarked on a number of extermination campaigns. Primarily those were conducted through a countrywide network of security centres, in fact closer to 300. And we'll see one of them. I'll be showing you some pictures from S21. Each security centre operated also a number of execution sites at which those as seen seen as being beyond re-education were simply executed. There were also, extermination campaigns directed at minority groups. So Cambodia's Chams and the Vietnamese were subjected to what we have described as genocidal campaigns. The Vietnamese were almost essentially completely exterminated in Cambodia by the end of the Khmer Rouge regime. The Chams were about 95% of that population was exterminated in a province known as Kampong Cham, which is their traditional home. And this is how we've sought to deal with these crimes. What you see here is a visual breakdown of the crime sites and criminal events that are alleged in case 002, the one that deals with the senior leaders. So we have 3 mass forced movements of the population. We have 5 forced labor sites, countrywide practice of forced marriage, 4 extermination or persecution campaigns, including the 2 genocides, 11 security centers, and 3 mass executions. Now, of course, no court could ever hope to conduct a trial with accused who are in their 80s with all of these crime sites. And so the trial chamber, in fact, severed the case into a series, potentially a series of back-to-back trials, the first of which was the one that we completed last year, and that dealt with only some of the charges. Now, I mentioned earlier that Khmer Rouge policies were characterized by a complete absence of concern for human suffering. And so that was described, I thought, rather eloquently by one of our expert witnesses, Philip Short, who wrote an authoritative biography of Pol Pot. So I'll play that now.
Can I ask you first to elaborate for us, if you could, on this idea of the evacuation itself and its immediate consequences being an almost perfect paradigm for the rest of what followed?
Well, I think the basis of that thought is that is the ruthlessness and single-mindedness and the lack of concern for human values, for human suffering, for individual values. That was shown during the evacuation. Later on, in the collectives, exactly the same attitude prevailed. What the Khmer Rouge wished to do was to achieve a given goal, whether it's the removal of millions of city dwellers to the countryside, the creation of agricultural cooperatives, collectives, which are capable of producing a particular level of rice yield, the building of irrigation works. In everything, the same approach, and in many cases the same finalities, that is large numbers of dead along the way, were how those programs were characterized. And you find all that in the very first step, which was the evacuation of the cities.
There, I think he describes it better than I ever could. All right, so this brings us to some of the visual evidence that I mentioned earlier. This is an image taken by a French photographer. His name is Roland Naveau. He was in Phnom Penh on the days leading up to the fall of the city. And what you see there is, this is an image from the 16th of April, so on the eve of the fall of the city, where refugees, as you can see, are streaming into the city. And this is a feature of the last months and years of the Civil War. Essentially, people were fleeing Khmer Rouge violence and entering the city. And so the population of the city was close to 3 million. And that entire population was then forcibly evacuated. These are some of the first Khmer Rouge tanks and armoured personnel carriers entering the city in the morning of the 17th of April. The final stages of the battle were not particularly brutal because the Khmer Republic regime essentially surrendered. And these are Khmer Rouge As you can see, battle-hardened soldiers entering the city. Now, following an initial period of perhaps a couple of hours of unease, people actually came out onto the streets and welcomed the troops because they felt, well, it's the end of the war, the Khmer people are going to reunite and hopefully the worst is behind us. And so that's captured in this image where you see now Roland Leveau on a Khmer Rouge personnel carrier and taking photographs of the people in the streets, and you can see that people are rejoicing at this stage and saluting the incoming forces. And here you see Khmer Republic officers and soldiers surrendering. Many of these were massacred later in that very day. This is a scene of one of those surrenders taking place. Within a couple of hours, by the early afternoon, an order was issued that the city must be evacuated. And that was communicated to essentially everybody. Megaphones and all around the city, armed Khmer Rouge soldiers forcing people out of their homes. And essentially by the evening, the evacuation was underway. And within, we believe, less than 2 days, the entire city was evacuated. Some 3 million people. And I said, one of the surviving images of the evacuation. And some images of the city after it was evacuated. It's often described by people who saw Phnom Penh in those days as a ghost city, because literally there were no people. This is an image from one of the forced labour sites that was set up. And you can see everybody's wearing black. That was a feature of these forced labour sites, is that we have hundreds of witness statements where people consistently say they were asked to wear, either given black clothes or asked to dye their own clothes black, because everybody had to wear black as a part of this levelling of society, removal, destruction of all classes, everybody equal. This is Ying Thirit, one of our accused that I was talking about earlier, visiting one of the crime sites with her bodyguards, or one of the forced labour sites, I should say. We treat them as crime sites. This is a photograph from a forced marriage ceremony. Forced marriages were conducted en masse, so in some cases 50 couples on either side, and people marrying people whom they didn't even know. Just a little bit about the administrative setup and how the country was administered. So Cambodia comprises 24 provinces and the capital Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge abolished that traditional administrative setup and replaced it with zones. The northwestern zone, western zone, southwest, east, etc. Each of these zones was run by a committee of 3 people appointed by the Central Committee and ultimately answerable to the Central Committee, and we say the leaders in Phnom Penh. And this is just another visual representation of that vertical structure. Here you see how the country was divided up first into zones, and each zone into a number of sectors, within each sector a number of districts, and then within each district a number of sub-districts. At each level of this authority structure was a committee appointed by the level above and answerable to the level above. One feature of Khmer Rouge rule that is of particular interest to us as prosecutors is the fact that lateral communication was prohibited. It means that Zone A was not permitted to communicate with Zone B under any circumstances. So there were matters that needed to be communicated. They had to go up to the party centre, leadership in Phnom Penh, and then come back down to the other zone. And that establishes, in our view, a very tight authority structure and control by the centre over the rest of the country. Another feature of that system was a vertical reporting system. So we see information being gathered or submitted by the sub-district, a district, or the sector, and then making its way into zone reports and ultimately being submitted to the party centre. Again, an illustration that the leaders in Phnom Penh were both kept aware of what was happening and keeping a very tight control on those under their command. Communications were conducted in a number of ways, including coded telegrams. So this is a copy of one of those telegrams. It was authenticated by the head of the telegram coding office in Phnom Penh. Well, very fascinating if you're a lawyer. Probably not if you're not. But again, of interest, this communication is being submitted to Pol Pot, so copies are being made at the receiving end, pursuant to standing instructions. Copy for Pol Pot, copy for Nguyen Chia, Ieng Sary, born vet, and other member of the leadership. And Office State 70, which we allege was run by Khieu Samphan. Another form of record that has been invaluable in the prosecution of these cases are standing committee minutes. There's only a small set of them that have survived, but even within that small set, there's extremely important evidence of the planning of the crimes, of the awareness on the part of the leaders of the crimes being committed around the country, of their receipt of reports, etc. And very importantly, who was attending? Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, Khieu Samphan. These three men, two of whom are on trial, the most frequent attendees at standing committee meetings. Now this is the part that gets a bit graphic, so if I can again remind those who are not comfortable with viewing scenes of torture, perhaps you might want to excuse yourself. First from Professor Chandler. Professor Chandler is an emeritus professor at Monash University. He's one of the world's leading experts on the history of the Khmer Rouge. And he wrote an authoritative book on S21, one of the prisons that we're going to be looking at, the prison that was run by Dutch. And here he talks about the use of biographies. I mentioned the biographies earlier. And he really illustrates how the gathering of biographies from people was an important tool in discovering from their perspective enemies.
Biographies were the key. They figured, the DK figured that elements of your past life would be indicative of how you would operate. In other words, if you were a middle peasant, you were less likely to be a loyal communist than if you were a poor peasant. If you had any relatives in the Lon Nol regime or had perhaps been a monk for any period of time, these made you more questionable, less pure. So we tried to dredge up this information, and these biographies, even among people who were not accused of crimes, were repeatedly requested to see if there are any changes or if you had omitted some detail. So it's a very important weapon of the regime, or let's not use such a strong word. Let's say a tool. It was a tool the regime used to maintain control and to find out who the people were that they were using as their representatives.
Now, if there is a smoking gun in relation to the Khmer Rouge crimes, this would have to be it. It's a decision that was issued by the Central Committee on the 30th of March 1976, and it delegates to authorities at various levels of the Khmer Rouge structure the power to smash. That's an authorization to kill people extrajudicially. And so we say that that is an extremely important piece of evidence in the case against the leaders, because all of our accused, the ones standing trial at the moment, were members of the Central Committee. So a little bit about Security Center S21. It was the most important and the largest. It was based in Phnom Penh, set up in 1975. It was formerly a high school and a primary school. The recorded number of prisoners and the number of deaths for which Duch was convicted is 12,272. The actual number is probably in the range of 15 to 16,000. They were all registered upon arrival, photographs were taken, a case file was created, and then they were sent to their cells before they were assigned to one of the interrogators and underwent interrogation and torture. When asked about whether torture was always used, Dutch said torture is inevitable. It's only a question of whether it's a little or a lot. Some of these paintings that I'm going to show you were painted by one of the 7 survivors of S21. The men that survived S21 were artists and mechanics, people that could help Dutch with various aspects of the prison. So Van Naut, the man who painted these paintings, was assigned by Dutch to make paintings of Pol Pot and various images of the revolution. So he created these paintings after the fall of the Khmer Rouge. And what he depicts here is a common detention room. Many prisoners were held in these types of rooms, shackled at their feet, with a guard, 24-hour presence of a guard inside and outside the room. In many cases, once tortured, prisoners were not returned to these common cells because there was a view that if other prisoners could see the sort of harm and torture that had been inflicted on the person returning from interrogation, that would lead to panic among the other prisoners and create unrest. So in many cases, after interrogation and torture, they were held in these smaller cells. And so we have photographs of prisoners from small cells. This is from a common cell. As you can see, there's prisoners lying behind this man. All of these people died. Children, there were 155 recorded children on the S21 list. When asked whether that number was accurate, Dutch said it was probably more accurate. A figure of 200 to 300 would probably be more accurate. And one of the reasons for the imprisonment and execution of children is that in many cases the Khmer Rouge decided to bring in family members once a cadre was identified as a spy. Interrogations and torture. Purposes of the interrogations were to, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, extract proof of subversive activity against the regime, confirm the detainee's guilt and justify his or her execution, because all of them were executed at S21. Some of the other security centres I mentioned earlier had a re-education function as well. There was another centre associated with S21 where people were sent for re-education through forced labour. In many cases, those being re-educated would also end up at the prison and be executed. But if you were lucky enough that you were at a re-education facility, and for some reason they decided that you're okay, that you might have survived. And of course, a key feature of the interrogation was to identify additional traitors and all prisoners in their confessions as a final part of the confession list their associates. So having confessed to subversive activity against the regime, they then list other traitors, and in many cases those other people are then arrested. Features of the confessions are that they're in standardized form, which again goes to the issue of systematicity from a prosecution point of view. In many cases, people were being, because they weren't guilty of anything really, there was no real subversive activity that many of these people were being forced to confess to it. So sometimes they're confessing to being CIA and KGB agents at the same time. And these are some of the paintings from Van Naut. There are a number of these graphic images which were taken when prisoners died during interrogation. S21 was run with such discipline that one of the rules that was put in place was that if a prisoner died before their interrogation and confession was complete, that is before they were properly removed and executed in accordance with standard operating procedures, then a case file had to be prepared and a report written as to why that person died before they were supposed to die. And so that's why we have these photographs. This is a brief video clip that I'm going to skip in the interest of time. The case files contain, apart from the confessions, also memoranda from interrogators to Dutch, reporting on the types of answers that extracted and types of torture that was inflicted. So here we see that this was a very senior prisoner, Minister of Information. His real name was Hu Nim. He'd been whipped 4 to 5 times and then waterboarded before this report was submitted. And the confessions, this is the prisoner's handwriting. This here is an annotation by the interrogator and then acknowledgement by Dutch. Some of the most powerful evidence against the leaders is also in the confessions, or this is if you imagine a manila folder. This is the cover, the top cover. And what you see there is an annotation that one copy was sent to Brother Norn. And David Chandler testified that that meant Norn Chia. Executions, again, recorded meticulously by Dutch and his staff. This is Chung Ek, the killing field that was used for S21. Photograph taken, we believe, in 1979, 1980. The stupa that is on site contains 8,900 skulls, so that's the number of human remains excavated at that particular site. These are some of the other Khmer Rouge security centers around the country. Alex talked about the death toll in her introduction. This is one of the studies that were taken into account by court-appointed demographic experts. And this particular study shows how the population rises up to 7.9 million as it's 75, and then there's a drastic drop there. By 79, it's 5.4 million. So that would suggest 2.5 million. But the best estimate the court demographer could come up with was 1.75 to 2.2. Just a little bit about the court. I'm a lawyer. I have to talk about the court. So it was established pursuant to an agreement between the United Nations and the Cambodian government. It's technically a Cambodian court because it's actually established under a Cambodian statute, but it only exists or comprises both national and international judges. So it's an ad hoc tribunal in that sense. We have limited jurisdiction. We can't prosecute cases or events occurring before the 17th of April 75, which is the day that the Khmer Rouge rose to power, or after the 6th of January 1979, which is when they were toppled. We're also restricted in the types of people that we can target. So the court's personal jurisdiction extends only to senior leaders and those most responsible for the crimes. As I mentioned earlier, it's a mixed national and international tribunal. All our chambers, we don't run jury trials. We have a trial chamber comprising 5 judges, 3 of whom are Cambodian and 2 international, and then there are 2 reserves. And that structure is replicated throughout the court, national and international. The prosecutor's office is headed by a national and an international chief prosecutor. All accused are represented by national and international defense counsel, and court staff also are mixed. There are provisions in the court statute, which may not interest you greatly, but there are provisions to ensure that decisions can only be made by supermajority. And that means that no decision can be made by the court that is a decision only by the nationals or by the internationals. Okay, applicable law. We apply both Cambodian law that was applicable at the time. We apply international conventions that were applicable at the time of the crimes, and those would include the Genocide Convention and the Geneva Conventions from 1949, and also other crimes which were not then covered by specific international conventions, such as crimes against humanity. Just going to skip through some of this stuff, just to say that the ECC uses the inquisitorial model, which means that our investigations are conducted by judges. We have 2 co-investigating judges who lead the criminal investigation. So it's a bit like inquests in our legal system in Australia. They interview witnesses and prepare a dossier, which then is forwarded to a trial chamber, and then parties appear before the trial chamber at trial and examine witnesses, present documents from the case file, or new documents that they may wish to propose. We have access to the investigation, both the prosecution and the defense. We can request specific investigative steps. Another feature of the ECC is participation of victims as civil parties. I can answer questions about that. Some of these details may not be of interest to everyone in the room, but the ECC is unique in that victims can attain the status of parties in their own right. The the International Criminal Court and the Special Tribunal for Lebanon have victim participation as a feature of the criminal procedure, but only at the ECC are victims actually recognised as parties to the trial. This is a picture of the courtroom. Again, this is more legal stuff which may not be of interest to everyone in the room. I'll just point out a couple of features. The rules of evidence are relaxed somewhat, and that's a feature of all international tribunals. There are basic rules of evidence, but generally speaking, we can adduce hearsay. And the idea there is that because the trials are presided over by a professional panel of judges, there are no juries, and so judges can hear this material and give it its appropriate weight or non-weight. All trials are open to the public, and that's a very important feature of what we do. More than 100,000 people have come through and watched the trials. And that last point there, if anyone's so inclined, all transcripts are available on the court website, as well as AV recordings of all the witness testimonies. And just before I close, I thought I'd try and close on a positive note. Some of you may have seen the movie The Killing Fields, and that movie depicts the story of two men, a Cambodian, Dith Pran, who was an assistant to a number of foreign journalists in Phnom Penh in April '75, and the other man, Sidney Schamberg, who was a New York Times correspondent also based in Phnom Penh. Sidney Schamberg and Dith Pran, as well as a number of other journalists, decided not to flee Phnom Penh, even though that option was available to them in the days in early April when the fall of the city was imminent. Dith Pran saved the lives of 3 men who went on to become famous journalists, including Sidney Schamberg, by intervening with a Khmer Rouge officer when they were arrested on the 17th of April because they were roaming around town taking pictures and trying to collect information about what was happening. Having saved them, though, they were all eventually herded to the French embassy compound in Phnom Penh. So as the Cambodian population was evacuated from the city, the foreigners were all essentially settled in the French embassy compound, which was the largest embassy compound in Phnom Penh, before they were transported out of Cambodia. Dith Pran and all the other Cambodians had to leave, and so he spent 3 years and 8 months in Khmer Rouge cooperatives and survived. In January '79, when the Khmer Rouge were toppled, he walked to Thailand, crossed the border, and went into one of the refugee camps. And he sent this photograph to Sidney Schamberg, and on the back of it, he wrote only his name and the word survivor. He went on to lead a prosperous life in the United States with his family and died some years ago. But 35 years later, Sidney Schamberg testified at the ECCC and described Dith Pran as his brother. And it was one of the more compelling testimonies. Of course, dozens of Cambodians testified as well, and all of their stories are incredibly, incredibly compelling. But I thought this particular story of the 2 men kind of encapsulated both the tragedy of Cambodia and some of the work that we're trying to do in giving something back for the failures of the international community in stopping the atrocities when they were being committed. That's all I wanted to say tonight. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much. It was very touching, moving. Now, how long did the trial last? And that's the easy part. Other part, do you think inquisitive approach is the right approach to trials of this nature, as opposed to the adversarial, which we are all used to in the Anglo culture?
Thank you. The first trial of the senior leaders on a limited number of charges took 2 years, or just under 2 years. It was effectively 220 trial days because you have recesses and the court only 64 days a week. So they're long trials. They're much longer than any domestic trial would be. As to which of the 2 models is better suited, I think these trials can only be properly conducted in a hybrid setting. Neither model is entirely well suited through these types of proceedings. But I will say that I think one of the difficulties with the inquisitorial system, and in fact, the proof is in the pudding, our own trial chamber has actually adopted a more adversarial procedure at trial. The collection of evidence by independent judicial officers, you know, many people will argue that's a perfectly sound way of going about it. It's a good way of collecting evidence of the truth, because that's what they're governed by. The investigating judges are required to collect all evidence, whether it's inculpatory or exculpatory. At trial, though, I think an adversarial procedure is more efficient, simply because counsel who are familiar with the case can then present the evidence, which is how case 2 was litigated. And then, of course, the judges can still ask questions, and they do, and they did in this case. So I think a hybrid, actually, you have to try and borrow the best features of both systems and try and make it work.
Well, thank you for interesting lecture. Just a couple of questions. First one, in your understanding, there are any alternatives for new government of Democratic Cambodia do not remove population from Phnom Penh? This one is the first question. And second question, I'm as a lawyer, as a student, or as a Russian lawyer, interested, what is the significance for People's Tribunal sentence 1979 for your procedure, and how it's compared with rule of double jeopardy? Thank you.
Thank you. Whether other options were available, will we say definitely. There's absolutely no reason to evacuate the city. It was the worst possible thing you could have done in the circumstances. There had been a shortage of food in Phnom Penh, and that shortage was actually a result of a siege that had been laid by the Khmer Rouge. Removing the entire population from the city meant that food could not be delivered to them. Of course, it was accompanied by all sorts of horrific mistreatment of these people. So it was not a humanitarian exercise by any stretch of the imagination. Several of our expert witnesses have confirmed that in great detail, as well as the witnesses, that, in fact, witnesses who experienced the events. When Sidney Shamberg testified, I took him through a diary that he wrote at the time. And some of the things he recorded in that diary were conversations he had with United Nations representatives, International Red Cross representatives, humanitarian workers who were in Phnom Penh, whom he had asked whether or not they were able to deliver aid to refugees in the city or people being evacuated. And they all could confirm without exception that they were prevented from having anything to do with delivering humanitarian aid. So the Khmer Rouge actively prevented aid from reaching the people and put them in a situation, we allege, that caused enormous suffering. Whereas if they were interested in feeding the people or addressing a humanitarian crisis, well, you can keep the people where they are. That's the easiest way to deliver humanitarian aid. The second question about the 1979 trial, we have those materials on the case file. We have not used them extensively. There are concerns about whether or not that trial met international fair trial standards, and so essentially the evidence before the court was some of those documents from the Khmer Rouge era, and lots and lots of witness statements, expert reports, and that type of thing.
Hi, much easier question, I think. What was the thought process behind the forced marriages?
That's a very difficult question. It actually brings up a very important point. What drove a lot of these policies? Why were they so absolute and so brutal? Well, the Khmer Rouge were obsessed with a paranoia of Vietnamese domination. They were convinced that they would be ultimately toppled, dominated, and subjugated to Vietnamese control. That's what drove a lot of their policies. And the idea behind forced marriage was to rapidly increase the population overnight. So that's the other tragic aspect of this, is that people were forced to consummate their marriages and to have babies in order to rapidly increase the population. Of course, as the evidence shows, none of it worked.
I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the challenges that you face as a prosecutor in relation to the passing of time since the events took place. And I was wondering also if you could reflect on other conflicts that haven't yet got to the stage of the CCC, and for those of us who are working on other conflicts that are a little bit, have more time to run, what advice you would give us in terms of the investigations that we're doing.
Thank you. We face great challenges. It was on one of the slides, but I skipped it in the interest of time. And those challenges apply to both prosecution and defence. Witnesses fading memories, lack of documents, or limited availability of documents. All of those things make it a lot harder to prosecute. Even crime sites, availability of actual material at crime sites. All of that becomes so much harder when you're collecting the exhibits and that type of thing. So, you know, it doesn't take a legal expert to realise that the sooner you get there, the better. As to how to go about collecting information about other atrocities, there's a whole host of measures. I've spoken to some people who are working on the alleged atrocities in Sri Lanka. Some of the things that are crucial there are looking at witness protection concerns, how the information is treated, confidentiality. What's really important also is that people who are questioning the witnesses understand the subject matter that they're dealing with. So placing the testimony in a framework that makes sense, knowing what questions to ask, being thorough, methodological, having a pre-prepared list of issues, list of questions, having an agreed convention for transliteration of names, because that can become a real issue. That this information gets fed into databases, and if people are transliterating names differently, that can become a challenge in terms of finding information. And then, of course, ultimately, the use of databases and systems to catalogue and record. Someone in this room who's just been assisting you with an ongoing investigation in this very sense. So, yeah, there's a whole lot of really important things, and I'm happy to talk to anyone who's interested in some more advice on that.
Hello. I'm just interested about your personal thoughts on this. You've obviously now gained a very intimate appreciation of the story of the past, but having been in Cambodia and seeing also maybe the prevailing disappointment of the people and the expatriates, that those perpetrators, their families are still beneficiaries of power in what is still a kind of corrupt system. Are you optimistic about the future, especially when it comes to empowering the Cambodian people to get on with it?
That's a difficult question for a prosecutor to answer. It sort of goes beyond my area of expertise, but to give you a personal perspective, I'm an optimist when it comes to Cambodia. Even in the time that I've been there, the country has developed enormously. Yes, the human rights situation could be much better. The transition to democracy, one hoped, might have occurred a lot more quickly. There's a long way to go for Cambodia, but there is a strong presence of international human rights organisations, of international governments that work with the Cambodian government. There is evidence of significant improvement in many areas. For example, the history of the Khmer Rouge period was never dealt with in, or at least not in a formal fashion, in primary and high school education before the establishment of the court. And the establishment of the court has been a catalyst for the production of a textbook on the history of the Khmer Rouge period, which we've reviewed and which is essentially accurate, which is now part of the formal curriculum in primary and high schools. So those sorts of processes of information being shared, transition back to rule of law, full democracy, all of those sorts of things takes time. We do a lot of capacity building work with Cambodian officials, with judges and prosecutors, and that's actually worked really well. So yeah, work in progress.
Hi, Tarik. Well, I just sort of had my question asked, but maybe I could broaden it slightly. I just would like you to express your opinion on whether Hun Sen and the Cambodian People's Party, in your opinion, they being a negative influence on the court as a whole.
It's a very, very tricky question to ask, Lewis. No, I wouldn't answer that question simply because of my role as a UN official. Look, what one has to remember is that the Cambodian government has actually invited the UN and requested its assistance formally in prosecuting these people. I, as a UN official, staff member, have never been interfered with or prevented from doing my job. Are these tribunals subject to political considerations, pressures, and and the like, absolutely, but that is not, one, it's not unique to the ECC. All of these tribunals, if you look at the history from the Yugoslavia Tribunal to the Rwanda Tribunal to the War Crimes Chamber in Sarajevo where I used to work, etc., etc. All of these tribunals are subject to various political pressures and dynamics. What is essential is that people within the tribunal retain their professionalism. And so we don't particularly care about the attitude of any government and what, whether or not we're making them happy. And so we just get on with it. And I think for as long as that's the attitude of people working within these courts, the attitudes of governments will be far less relevant and hopefully will have far no impact on the outcomes.
We've got time for like 2 more questions, if that's okay. So we'll just go from there.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the role that human rights organisations in Cambodia have played in this process. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of DCCAM in terms of, having that existing documentation there, identifying potential witnesses, incidents, etc.
Essential. Sarah and I had to litigate the admissibility of material received from DCCAM. If it wasn't for DCCAM, these proceedings may have been impossible to conduct. It's the world's #1 repository of Khmer Rouge archives, as I'm sure you know. They're a professionally run NGO. They've kept the materials safe. They've catalogued them properly. They also took thousands upon thousands of witness statements, some of which also we've used. So they've been, nothing but a positive force. The executive director of DCCAM and the deputy director testified at the court about provenance, chain of custody issues, etc., with respect to these records. So that's one organisation that we're very proud of. At the same time, perhaps wisely, they sort of keep it at an arm's length from the court. They do their work independent of us. They have people working on reports, on monitoring of our trials, and critique of our work, which I think is a good thing because they're certainly competent and qualified to observe what's happening and to comment on it. Yes.
Hi, I just had a question which maybe follows on from the previous one. How do you feel this trial took place in Cambodia, in the capital there, and the community was able to watch, which seems to be an essential part of sort of reconstructing communities when justice needs to be done, compared to, for example, the Rwanda war tribunals, which are taking place in Tanzania. Considering sort of the two against each other, how valuable would you say that it has been to have the trials take place with regard to restorative justice within the community itself?
I think the hybrid tribunals are the way of the future, provided you can set them up properly, fund them. I think in theatre tribunals have so much more to deliver than just trials. I mean, we are a criminal court, and what we do is prosecute, defend, and render judgments on criminal cases. But by virtue of our presence in the country, I feel we have a far greater impact in terms of public information and outreach than what any tribunal that's based in The Hague or another country could ever do. And so my view of the future for international criminal law, if there is one, is that the International Criminal Court will have, will be one court which will deal with cases of concern to humanity as a whole, but that there will be other tribunals set up to deal with, because the ICC can only ever prosecute a small number of cases, whereas hybrid tribunals can deal with a greater number, depending on how their jurisdiction is defined. The court in Sarajevo, where I worked, has been in existence for less than 10 years, and I think it's already surpassed the ICTY's number of cases in terms of prosecutions, convictions, acquittals, etc. So I think hybrid tribunals have a huge amount to offer, but they can also only occur where you have the right political climate, where it's safe, etc.
Another question, but look, I just want to thank you, Tarik, for that incredible, if not devastating, presentation tonight. But more importantly, thank you very much for the work you do. Your tireless sifting through evidence, historical evidence, and hearing of, deeply distressing testimony in your quest to achieve justice for the Cambodian people. is just wonderful. So thank you very much for coming. And thank you everyone else.
This one's huge. Oh yeah, I'll